Hello and welcome to Being Crisis Prepared, the business continuity podcast from Invroy Crisis Management. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Pugh-Cook to talk about the subject of lessons and what do we mean by that in a business sense and how we can perhaps start to do it better. Everyone will be aware that there's been much discussion in the political field on the back of pandemic preparation and what lessons can we identify. But I think from most of our listeners won't get a chance to influence pandemic lessons, but we will get a chance to influence our own organisation and how we improve and work towards that. So that's what we're going to talk about, hopefully for 15 to 20 minutes. And it's great to have you on board. But Mark, before we start, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about yourself and why I've asked you to join us today to talk about lessons.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Good day, everybody. I'm an independent consultant and as an associate with Invroy Crisis Management. And I work specifically on the management of risk, business continuity management, resilience, and to a lesser degree also on international security sector reform. My experience is based on over 30 years operational service in the British Army. And what I really do look at is specialising in analytical evaluation of situations to deliver incisive decision making, an effective study of the lessons identified process, which we'll cover in a minute, to enhance capability and management processes, as well as the organisation and delivery of concise training programmes to grow expertise. So very much the lessons piece following into the training piece.
Okay, hopefully everyone, as we go through the call, will start to go, wow, Mark really does know his stuff. And I know that. And hopefully in 20 minutes time, everyone else will go, wow, I've taken away 2 or 3 really useful pointers that I can take to my organisation. So perhaps if I can start with what I think sounds like a really easy question, but I have a feeling is probably a more difficult answer. But what do we mean when we talk about lessons? And is there a difference between lessons identified and lessons learned? What would you think?
Absolutely. The lessons process considers both identified and learned, and I'll talk through that. But broadly, what the process does is it's a system of describing people, things, and activities related to the act of learning from experience to achieve improvements. Within an organisation, it's through a formal approach to learning, and so the individuals in the organisation can reduce the risk of repeating mistakes and increase the chance that successes are repeated. And what I really want to stress here is everyone thinks negatively about lessons, but actually it's a positive thing. If something really good has happened, how can that become part of your continuous improvement to become best practice within the organisation? And so what lessons is, it is a continuous loop of a cycle looking at continuous improvements, starting with identifying something, going through a process of understanding what that is, and then from getting to the concept of learning, whereby everyone takes the information away, you can then put it into training programs, exercises, operational capability, and then the loop goes around again as that one becomes part of your process, the formal process. Actually, it will continue to evolve and adapt as you're continuing along your cycle.
So I guess from if you think about the Japanese approach of, I think it's Kaizen. With continuous improvement. That's what we're trying to do, isn't it? Is find a process that allows us to identify the issue, learn from it, share that, and then so it becomes the new embedded way of working or best practice. It sounds as a colleague described this to me the other day. He said that having an incident is not good, but not learning from it is positively bad. And I thought that was a really telling phrase of, how do we create that culture that I think you're going to talk about in a second, but of it becoming everybody's business, is to how can I as an individual be better, but also how can we make the company better from identifying these issues, sharing it and embedding. Okay. So if we were to try and identify a procedure for doing this, where would we start? What's the sort of foundation level lessons, if you like?
Well, the foundation is actually within the culture of the organisation, Matthew, that every member of the organisation needs to have the feeling of empowerment that they can experience something, share the positive and the bad within the organisation, and to feel that the senior leadership and the senior management within that organisation empowers them to do that. And from a cultural perspective for that organisation, if it is driven, which it should be, by the senior management team, people realise that it's not a negative thing, because I think there is often this perception of, oh God, I saw something that I didn't really like, and I don't want to be seen as someone who's snitching on somebody else, or I'm admitting a failure. No, it must be seen as part of personal development, that actually you are contributing something positive for the organisation, improving the organisation. And the only way that that's going to be delivered is if the senior management team say, yes, we own this process. We have staff who are specifically tasked to manage this process of lessons and embed this culture of continuous improvement for the staff and for the organisation, and for the leadership themselves to say, okay, on a routine basis, monthly, 3 monthly or whatever, to say, right, take us through what are the key lessons that we have learnt over this period, and if there has been a negative thing, a remedial action process needs to go through, and an action body. So therefore, one person or a team need to take it forward to work on that continuous improvement. So it goes part of that cycle as you're going through the learn process, and then background into the identified as you continue.
So the thoughts that strike me on these things is so many times, I'm sure we've all been on exercises that you come away with, a post-training report or a post-exercise report that says, here are the observations and here are some recommendations, and it's a nice table and you can color code it and have status on progress towards closing it and who's the lead and all these sorts of things. But then 6 months later, the same point comes up on the exercise, and it sounds as though that's the key, is not just we've observed a failing and we've made a suggestion for improvement, but it's making sure that then is in place and is the new standard, the new way of working, so that we don't have the same issue every few months and it's there are 6 people that do that role in our roster, and therefore they've each got to learn through their own experience rather than learning through someone else's, which is obviously inefficient and just pointless. Is that where we're at? Is that what we mean?
Precisely. I mean, that is the issue of the same lesson being identified 3 or 4 times, but because the action plan has not been put into place to the remedial part, someone hasn't owned it and taking it forward in terms of the learning. That's the reason why it hasn't actually moved forward. And if it is something that is in terms of basic business practice, well, that might be okay, but it could be losing you thousands of pounds in your business plan. Worst of all, if it is of an incident which could have a health and safety implication, that means that people's lives are potentially in danger, and that is much, much worse. So you've got a balance between ordinary business process and something which actually could involve health and safety requirements, and that is absolutely critical to make sure you go through the formal identification process. It doesn't become a blame game. It is okay, this is what went on. We fully read out the whole situation. And that's why it's an observation of and a discussion of what was identified, and then you take it through and say, right, okay, this is what we need to learn from it. This is how we take it forward, and this is who's going to own it in taking it forward.
Okay. The other thought that strikes me just while you were talking there is the idea that presumably not only can you learn from your own experience, but you can learn from the experience of others within the sector. and the importance of reading widely as to what is going on. And there are any number of quarterly incident summaries, for example, that are out there with very good websites and explanations of what I would hope is fact rather than rumor and conjecture. But is that equally important, that you look widely for these things?
Absolutely, it's best practice. I mean, that's what should be looked at. And if I can give you an example, which is linked to where we are with the current coronavirus pandemic, and that is that the UK government has a national risk register, in it, which refreshes on a fairly regular basis. And its 2017 version made it quite clear that pandemic influenza was the top concern. And for that, they actually ran an exercise called Exercise Cygnus at the back end of 2016, going through all the scenario of what was going to be required from it, with a huge number of recommendations. But that report never saw the light of day until in late 2020, so whilst we were in the pandemic, and it became apparent that there was something out there, so the Department of Health and Social Care was obliged to publish a redacted version. And that's a frustration of an example of an exercise which really got into the weeds of a scenario. And if it had been, so lessons were identified, but they weren't learnt. So 4 years later, we're into a pandemic, and you go through some of those recommendations, thought, right, we should have upgraded our scale of personal protective equipment to make sure it wasn't out of date. We should have had plans for developing our ICU bed capability. We should have formalized our plans for how we were going to deal with education issues. All these were covered in Exercise Cygnus, and then came home to haunt the British government as the coronavirus pandemic took place. So that is, at the strategic level, geopolitical level, the most extreme example that I can give you.
And I guess the issue, though, is that cost-benefit analysis, that in that case, you had the alignment of it's top of the risk register, we've run an exercise, and we've not done anything. Whereas if it was bottom of the risk register, and you go, well, okay, on the likelihood and impact sort of type debate of your risk analysis, yes, the impact's going to be high. The likelihood is it's low. Therefore, well, do we need to do these things? Is there a discussion to be had? But when it's top of your risk register and you still do nothing, well, then that suggests there's a failing in the process somewhere. And I'm sure that there will be PhD students in the future looking at response to COVID, both nationally and internationally. That's not what we're here for, but it's that. What is the point of a lessons process if there's the structure and the leadership is not there to drive it home? And then when the event occurs, you go, oh, gosh, we knew that, but we did nothing about it. At COVID, yes, it's potentially a fatal issue, but what if that's your business that you've done that, and now you're in court and fatal accident inquiry because you knew that there was a risk, but you didn't communicate that in a way that closed out the issue. So you identified it, but you didn't learn from it. And I think that's probably the gist of what we're trying to get at is this isn't rocket science. This is something that we all intuitively know. Go hard after the information to work out why something wasn't working as well as it could do. It doesn't have to be failed, just didn't quite give you the results you expected. Well, okay, how can we make sure that next time that doesn't happen? Simple as that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in what you've very succinctly done there, Matthew, is to align the lessons process with the risk matrix. And fundamentally, you have got in that top right-hand corner of higher impact, high likelihood, the issue of a pandemic influenza. And so therefore, the fact that a process had started with an exercise that had been run was brilliant. And lessons were identified, and goes back to what I said right from the outset, how you can identify them. You can identify them multitude of times, but if you don't physically learn from them, then all you're doing is recreating a cycle of lessons identified.
Yeah, and the challenge of leadership is always the challenge of making decisions and living with those decisions. And I remember someone said to me that deciding not to make a decision is still making a decision. I think it was General Rupert Smith, but that you sort of have to think about that for a second. But if politicians, senior civil servants, whatever, looked at the report and went, okay, I hear you, but we're not going to do it because there's a higher priority for the cash involved to deal with current patients, to deal with current education challenges, whatever it might be that is the draw on the national budget. I guess that's defendable. It's come home to roost, as you say. It was hindsight. It was the wrong decision, but at least it was a decision. And I think that's the bit that will come out in future discussions. But no, obviously that's the geopolitical, the massive challenge that globally we're all faced with. But I think there's probably other examples from an oil and gas perspective. For example, the Deepwater Horizon or Macondo, depending on which title you know it by, is perhaps the most recent massive example of an oil incident. Going back further, though, for UK listeners, the Piper Alpha world, and lessons are learnt. The Lord Cullen report from Piper Alpha that fundamentally changed health and safety. I saw the Herald of Free Enterprise, the car ferry that capsized in the Channel, the Bradford City fire. These major inquiries that come up with recommendations. So there are good examples of how these things work. And I guess that's the frustration when there are also bad examples. And how do we as businesses take the time in our chaotic constant Teams or Zoom meetings, rushing from one challenge to the next at the moment, but to still stand back and work on the business rather than in the business to say, actually, we can do better. And that is a leadership challenge.
Absolutely. And I think there are two issues there that you've raised I'd like to come back on. One is cost benefit analysis. And that is why it goes back to the heart of this process having to be owned by senior management. Because it needs to be laid out on a plate to them. If we don't do this, okay, it might cost us less in terms of our business practice. However, if it goes wrong and we don't do this, it's going to cost us considerably more.
Perfect. And that's the bit that's always missing in a bow tie type analysis is the succinct, so what? Yeah. What does that actually mean? You've got a very sexy little diagram. Thanks very much. Yeah. Lovely slide. What do you actually want me to do with that information?
So, and that goes back to that whole risk matrix piece, therefore, of the likelihood and the impact. And you're bringing the two together. So from you're tying the lessons piece with the risk management perspectives that need to go with it. The other point I want to come back to from what you were just talking about was you raised a series of inquiries, and another one that's ongoing at the moment is the Grenfell fire tragedy. And the problem with inquiries is that they always come up with an absolutely shocking summary of the failings that went on. But they've taken so long to implement, and things have moved on. And in electoral terms, it means another electoral cycle has gone through, or something like that. And therefore, fundamentally, with Grenfell Tower, I mean, the key thing at the moment is that was caused by flammable cladding. So the first recommendation is every single building in the United Kingdom that has got flammable cladding on should have it replaced as a matter of priority, because there will be another Grenfell fire type disaster
unless we don't do something about it.
Absolutely. So it goes why you don't need an inquiry to tell you that. You need, and I know belatedly the government is now coming up with cash for it, but what you've got to have to say, this has been identified, we need to learn from this. If we do not learn from it, we will have more fatalities caused because people will say you haven't learned from Grenfell.
You almost need the equivalent of sort of the hot debrief What are the big ticket? There may not be the low hanging fruit, the quick wins, but they're the really obvious lessons that everyone can see. And I'm sure if we looked at Manchester, that inquiry that's ongoing, I think at the moment as well, still ongoing, there will be similar quick wins that I think, to be honest, the whole debate about medical teams going in, etc. I think it was medical teams that was held back.
Medical security.
That's been rectified already. So telling me that that's a recommendation, actually, I don't need to wait for the report to do that. So no, you're quite right. And timeliness is because otherwise people have forgotten, moved on, something else is in their in tray, and it's too late, and we're missing the opportunity, or we're carrying the risk for the entire time that is being debated, rather than just saying, hang on a second, let's get after it. And we're now either less vulnerable staff environment, or we're able to deliver a better result to our client, whatever that might be, because we're doing it in a better way, or less likely to fail because we've got a backup and the system is running like clockwork. Great. Is there anything else there that you can share with the listener that before we draw this call to a close?
Well, I mean, I think the key thing is, I focused slightly on where we were with the pandemic, but a couple of other examples. And I think it is important to realize that this is right across business. It's whether it's political leadership, business management processes. You talked about Deepwater Horizon as an example, but you can think of another one which is very current in infrastructure terms, is that the economy of the ninth biggest economy in the world, Texas, completely froze physically and metaphorically a month ago. They had snowstorms which came out of nowhere. One reason why it failed is because they have been doing a lot of thinking ahead for climate change. I've got a huge number of wind farms that they have now put in across Texas. Those wind farms generating electricity froze during that particular scenario. And that's part of the reason why the electricity failed in Texas in the way that it did. So there's already work going on in terms of that. So as we move forward in terms of the lessons piece and we look at the global economy and climate change, it is absolutely fundamental. We are thinking ahead of all these examples. So we think we're doing the right things by going for renewable energy and everything else. But there is still that possibility of something going wrong. And therefore, we should be, it's linking that whole risk matrix piece with the lessons process and how you move forward from it.
Brilliant, Mark. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. For the listeners, hope you found that useful. If there is one takeaway, I think, from today is please have a look at your lessons process and make sure that it is actually fit for purpose and delivering across your companies, your organizations, what you hope it is delivering. Because if it's not, then you're carrying risk that you really don't need to be carrying because you already identified that you should be doing something about it. As I say, Mark, thank you very much indeed for your time. Great for you to join the team. And for the listeners, we look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you very much indeed, Matthew. Thoroughly enjoyed it.